Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Senior English B. We turn now to Unit 5, the Historical Perspectives Focus Period information. The dates provided 1798 to 1832. We're on page 548 and following. I want you to first pay attention to the timeline at the bottom of the page that will go all the way to 551. Paying attention, of course, to some of the important events that are there mentioned. We also began with an era of change in voices of the period, starting with Napoleon Bonaparte and some of his quotes. There are three there. I am sometimes a fox and sometimes a lion. For those of us who have read our Machiavelli's Prince, we know where he got that idea from. The whole secret of government lies in knowing when to be the one or the other. He also says, history is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon. And finally, he says, impossible is a word to be found only in the dictionary of fools. Also, we've got Robert Fulton, the inventor, as the component parts of all new machines may be said to be old. It is a nice discriminating judgment which discovers that a particular arrangement will produce a new and desired effect. Therefore, the mechanic should sit down among levers, screws, wedges, wheels, etc., like a poet among the letters of the alphabet, considering them as the exhibition of his thoughts in which a new arrangement transmits a new idea to the world. End quote. And finally, from the obituary on King George IV, we get, if he ever had a friend, a dedicated friend from any rank of life, we protest that the name of him or her never reached us. End quote. Let's go ahead now and work through the history of the period starting at war with France. As the Romantic period opened in 1798, so you want to circle that date, 2 years before 1800, Britain had already been at war with France for 5 years. The war, which lasted more than 20 years, extended across 5 continents and cost Britain more than, an astronomical amount of money, right? It had a profound effect upon British society. By the early 1800s, approximately 1 in every 4 British men was in uniform. Wow, so circle that data point. That's an important one. In the ensuing conflict, 2 national heroes emerged for England. At sea, Lord Horatio Nelson shattered the French fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Make sure you circle that date, ensuring that Britannia would rule the waves for the next century. Nelson, dying at his moment of triumph, passed immediately into legend. On land, the Duke of Wellington defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, another monumental moment. With Napoleon in exile, the victors met at the conference known as the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, and tried to restore Europe to what it had been before the French Revolution. However, the ideas unleashed by that revolution and the earth-shaking changes of the Industrial Revolution were more powerful than any reactionary politician imagined. Our next heading, the power of steam. The revolution that had begun in the 18th century expanded in the 19th as Britain surpassed all other nations in industrialization. Circle that word, industrialization. We obviously will use it a lot in our conversations to come. Hand in hand with industrialization came population growth. The population of almost 10 million in 1790 grew to more than 14 million in 1821. Just look at the incredible amount of population growth. It was a young population, too, with an estimated 60% at 25 years old or younger. Modernization of the textile industry had begun in England. By 1800, the annual textile production had increased to 400,000 pieces from about 50,000 just 30 years earlier. It was the textile industry that was at the forefront of change. Underline that. That shocks a lot of students when they read that for the first time. It was, in fact, the textile industry that was at the forefront of change, moving the weaver from the spinning wheel in the kitchen to the enormous steam-driven looms on the factory floor. Meanwhile, in the United States and England, steam was revolutionizing transportation. In 1807, circle the date and the name, Robert Fulton launched his steamboat. And in 1814, George Stephenson built a steam locomotive. You could make the argument that that cell phone that you are so attached to now, in many ways is born of moments like this with these great inventors and the work they do. Railroads, of course, changed the face of England, and steamships shrank oceans. On to page 550, our next heading, working and living conditions. Revolutions are about power, and the Industrial Revolution was about the application of power to work. The creation of machines that work while human beings feed and tend them. There's your definition of industrialization and the Industrial Revolution, okay? Unfortunately, the mills and the cities that grew up around them destroyed the spirits and bodies of many who came from the countryside looking for new opportunities. Economic progress exacted an enormous human price. As Britain moved from being an agricultural to an industrial society, cities such as Manchester became smoky, crowded industrial centers in which men, women, and children toiled in factories, often for wages that barely allowed them to survive. While factory owners lived in splendor and a new middle class would begin to develop, workers often lived in squalor. So we have clearly the rise of that upper class, and then of course the very poor working class. Voice of the people, the next heading. During this period, what we now call the Romantic period, all the attitudes and assumptions of 18th century classicism and rationalism were dramatically challenged, in part by the social and political upheavals. The French Revolution had shaken the established order in the name of democratic ideals, while the Industrial Revolution boosted the growth of manufacturing, but also brought poverty and suffering for those who worked or failed to find work in slum-ridden cities. Faith in science and reason, so characteristic of 18th century thought, no longer applied in a world of tyranny and factories. The next heading, the Reform Act of 1832. With industrialization, wealth no longer depended on land, and workers, separated from the land, realized they would have to unite in political action. The Reform Bill of 1832, circle it in your books, the product of democratic impulses and changing economic conditions, was a first step in extending the right to vote. So write that down, that's huge. It increased the voting rolls by 57%, but the working class and some members of the lower middle class were still unable to vote. In the spirit of reform, just a year later, Parliament abolished slavery in the British Empire. The Reform Bill of 1832 was another part of the peaceful revolution that was transforming England. Although it extended the right to vote to many males previously disqualified by lack of wealth, women still were denied suffrage. Nonetheless, the 1832 bill was a step in a long journey that in the end gave all citizens voting rights. Our last heading, a changing monarchy. The age of the Hanovers was about to come to an end. By 1811, George III was declared insane and his son was named the Prince Regent. A regent substitutes for a ruler. The period became known as the Regency. The regent's conduct gave the period its scandalous reputation. In 1830, George IV was succeeded by his brother William, who had 10 illegitimate children with his common-law wife, but no legitimate heir. When William died in 1837, the daughter of his younger brother was next in the royal line. That daughter, Victoria, would become the queen, and then the symbol of an era in which political reform and industrial might made England the most powerful country in the world. And of course, we'll talk about the Victorian period in our next unit. All right, guys, let's turn now in Unit 5 to the great Wordsworth, and we'll introduce ourselves to the great Romantics. Thank you.